This morning on The Real Story, we're checking in with Connecticut's comptroller. After a long legislative session, where does the state budget stand? How are Connecticut's finances? And what are the impacts of federal funding cuts? Plus, we'll discuss the possibility of a special session this fall. Good morning and thanks for joining us here on The Real Story. I'm Emma Wolforst. We wrapped up a long legislative session a few weeks ago. So where does the state budget stand now? We're checking in with Connecticut's Chief Financial Officer, State Comptroller Sean Scanlon. Thank you so much for being here.
Good to be here.
So earlier this week, before we get into some of the state budget stuff, as we always say, you're handling all the state's finances. So earlier this week, the governor signed a bill modifying the state's Fallen Hero Fund, previously known as the Fallen Officer Fund, that was introduced last year. So walk me through first, why this was initially formed and what it exactly does.
Well, look, my dad was a police officer. My grandfather was a firefighter. So I come from a family of first responders. Yeah. And I know better than most that these are men and women who put their lives on the line for us every day. And unfortunately, there are instances all too often in my mind where we lose these first responders and that are killed in the line of duty. And so what this policy was about last year was saying that if a police officer is killed in the line of duty, we're going to be there to financially support their family members in the immediate aftermath of that terrible, terrible thing, and then also provide health insurance to them, because it's something that I was told was missing from what happens for some of these family members. That was in place for a year, and in a span of 20 months, we lost 2 police officers here in the state of Connecticut. So this year we went back to the legislature and I proposed a bill expanding it to say, instead of just covering police officers, we should do firefighters and EMTs and paramedics. And last week, the governor signed that bill. And again, it's something we hope to never use. And while I'm very proud to administer it, it's a very somber topic, but I know how important it is for these families. They are always there for us, and we need to be there for their families. You said administer it.
We mentioned you're handling the state's finances, but explain to us, for someone who might know, why is the comptroller's office involved in this sort of bill?
Well, I pay all the bills for the state, so that's a big one. But I also do a lot of the benefits for not just state employees, but for also municipal employees too. So I run the largest healthcare plan in the state, 250,000 people. 60,000 of them are municipal employees, like cops and firefighters, right? We have state troopers that I run all the benefits for. And so I'm the guy who cuts the checks, but I'm also the person who does the benefits. And this is an intersection of both those jobs. But for me, it's personal because I come from this family. And so I've been really proud to work with our law enforcement and first responder community to champion this bill. We can't do enough to thank them for what they do for us. The least we can do, in my mind, Emma, is to be there for their families if they pay the ultimate sacrifice for our state.
And it is a somber topic, and with your own, personal experience having family involved in law enforcement, how important is it for this to be in place now to sort of bridge that gap, as you mentioned, also with health care, which, as you said, as we found out a few years ago, wasn't in place for some of these families?
Yeah, I mean, this really began after what happened in Bristol, right? 2 police officers were killed tragically in the line of duty, October 2022. Yep. Both of their wives were immediately kicked off of their plan, not because the town wanted that at all, but it was just the way the contract worked. Yeah. And so when we began designing this plan, I went and saw the Bristol chief and I said, hey, chief, what would we do that would have helped these individuals? And he said, health insurance is something that often gets underlooked. Like I just said, I run this large health plan. We pay for out of the fund the premiums for them to have health insurance for 5 years. And I think, again, making sure small children and the spouses of these police officers, firefighters, EMTs killed in line of duty, it's the least we can do. And I think the fact that we're there for them is really, really important. And at the end of the day, in a $25 million budget, This is a relatively small sum of money, but a really, really important sum of money.
Absolutely. And when we're talking about those other benefits that you sort of oversee with the state, you've done a lot with municipal pension reforms. Where does that stand right now? And I understand there are some new developments there happening this summer.
Yeah, so I took office in 2023, and one of the first things that I did was sit down with all the different divisions, and I sat down with our pension folks, and they said, look, we got a big problem with our municipal pension.
Right.
For the last 5 years before you took office, the contribution rates of the cities and towns in this municipal pension plan run by my office had increased by 75%. I was like, oh my God, that sounds terrible. What are we doing about it?
Right.
And they said, well, nothing, because we haven't reformed this system in 40 plus years.
Right.
And to me, that was all I needed to hear to want to dive right in to do this. We assembled a working group, Democrats, Republicans, mayors and first selectmen, union leaders, and over 6 weeks in my office back in 2023, we put together the first reform of this system in over 4 decades. And that reform saves the taxpayers in 107 of our 169 towns, so 2/3 of the towns in the state.
Yeah.
Over $800 million over the course of the next 30 years. But we didn't want to stop there. I jokingly tell people all the time, it's kind of like a 3-movie trilogy. That was the first movie. The second movie we passed in 2024, which reformed the governance. But the really big one, the third movie in the trilogy, we just passed.
Okay.
And that creates MERS 2.0, right?
Okay.
So the MERS pension system, municipal pensions, they were created in 1949. Harry Truman was president. We've had one tier for every employee hired between 1949 and today. This bill changes that. And starting in a few years, every new cop or firefighter or public works official in new towns that join MERS and in towns that are there right now will join with a new plan. Why does this matter? 2 things. Number one, it keeps saving money for the taxpayers of Connecticut. People are fed up with the high cost of property taxes in our state. We hear about it all the time. This is immediate property tax relief for them in the form of less pension debt. But second, it preserves a pension for individuals, right? At a time when towns are having a really hard time recruiting first responders, right? The job has changed. It's a very, very difficult job. They're having a hard time finding people. We know that having good benefits for people and their families for retirement is one of the things that they gravitate towards. And I think the fact that we've reformed this system not only saves the taxpayers money, but it helps us address some of the public safety challenges that we have as a state. And I'm really proud that we've been doing this over the course of the last 3 years on a bipartisan basis.
And if people are interested, if they're either currently a state employee wondering how this will impact them, what do you want them to know about where they can get more information?
Our office has been out in the state going to these 107 towns and trying to make sure everyone is aware of the changes that take effect on July 1 of this year. So that 2023 bill takes effect in just a few days. But people can always reach out to me. I'd also say that as a result of the reforms that we've done, we just had our first new group, the Clinton Police Department, join MERS for the first time in 16 years.
Wow.
Right?
Okay.
So you're starting to see towns come into MERS for the first time in a very long time. And I think that that's an indication that people see that what we're doing is working.
Yeah.
And it's a tool in their toolkit. And I'm really proud of the progress we're making. We're not out of the woods yet, but we're making big progress.
And I do want to talk more about the state budget. So, before we get into some of the specifics of the new 2026-2027, how are the state of Connecticut's finances looking these days right now? What are we sort of looking at right now?
If 10 years ago we were in the midst of a fiscal crisis, today, by every stretch of that imagination, we are doing better than we were 10 years ago. Yeah. We've had 7 consecutive years, almost 8 at the end of this month, where we will end our fiscal year with a state surplus.
Yep.
We've paid down almost $10 billion at the end of this year of our pension debt. We have a $4 billion rainy day fund. It literally is the highest it can go. But what I say all the time, Emma, is that we have ended the fiscal crisis that the fiscal guardrails were put in place to end, but now we have an affordability crisis. And the budget that they just passed and the work that we need to do as a state, in my opinion, is finding the right balance between continuing our fiscal progress, but also attacking this issue of unaffordability in Connecticut. Healthcare, housing, energy, childcare, all these things are costing middle-class families too much money. And if we can find that sweet spot between paying down our debt, but also paying for the future, we're going to be in good shape, and I think the future of the state is very bright.
You always talk about that balance, and I do think that's so important. I hear that from state lawmakers as well. Really quickly, I want to talk about those fiscal guardrails.
Yeah.
It's been the term of the past few sessions because, with this stable financial situation, with this huge surplus that you talk about, a lot of lawmakers have brought up possibly rethinking, reworking, or reforming those fiscal guardrails. There was a lot of talk that it might happen this session because the governor really didn't talk about staunchly sticking by them as much as he did in his previous budget addresses this year in 2025. We know that didn't happen. The fiscal guardrails stayed in place. They weren't touched. Do you think that was a good idea, as you mentioned, as residents kind of face an affordability crisis and groups like nonprofits and education look to the lawmakers and say, why can't we get a bigger piece of that surplus?
Well, look, I think the guardrails worked to do the problem they were created to solve, which
Right.
was to get us out of that really bad fiscal crisis that we were in 2017, 2018, and those years. I think there will always be a need for some version of the guardrails. They've worked, and they're going to keep working. We're not out of the woods yet. But I think the guardrails need to be adaptive. And just like MERS 2.0, we need to figure out what guardrails 2.0 is going to look like. So often in government, we get wedded to this is just the way it is, and this is the way it's always been.
Right.
I don't think we have to do that. Businesses don't do that. They have to adapt. When things are changing in the economy or they're changing in that business, they adapt or they die. We have to adapt, and I think the guardrails need to be more adaptive. They expire in 2028. The legislature votes in 5-year increments to re-up them. They did that unanimously in 2023. I think we're going to spend the next couple of years having a big conversation of what the next iteration looks like. I'm someone who thinks they always need to be there in some form, but we need to make them adaptive to this moment because we're a very different place than 2017.
Maybe taking a look at what that form should look like come 2028.
Yeah, and I look forward to being part of that conversation. I think I will be. I know the governor, has indicated that he believes that they need to continue in some form, and I think everybody acknowledges that they should and that they've worked. The question is just what are they going to look like? And I think we can be very smart and disciplined and figure out what that should look like.
So now when it comes to the budget that got across the finish line on June 4th, there was some back and forth. At the start of the session, some legislative leaders were concerned and were telling us they weren't even sure if they would get a finished budget by the end of session, by adjournment. Obviously, they did. And just a few weeks before the session ended, some legislative leaders, Speaker Ritter, were suggesting possibly only passing a 1-year budget. As the comptroller, how are you feeling about the bill that did get across the finish line this year?
Well, I think it's good that they did pass the 2-year budget. We've been doing that for a very long time. I think it's important to give people that 2 years of a sense of able to plan and understand what's going to happen, right? For too long, Connecticut government was so unpredictable, and that was having big consequences on different sectors of our economy. So I think that predictability is good. Right. However, they passed that budget knowing that they may have to tweak it because of what's happening in Washington. And, I tell people all the time, the biggest threat to our financial solvency and progress is not Democrats and Republicans in Hartford. It's people in Washington. And it's the policies that we're seeing put in place by President Trump and the congressional Republicans. We do a lot of things constructively on a bipartisan basis here in Connecticut that what they're doing in Washington can dramatically upend. And whether we continue to slide into bad economic times and maybe even a recession, or we continue to see hundreds of millions of dollars of cuts and potentially billions if this big, beautiful bill passes, the legislature and the governor are going to have to make some hard choices about whether we go back and redo that budget or use that rainy day fund. I think we need to be very careful about how we do this, but I also think that we have a moral obligation to step in and make sure for things like Medicaid, for example, which covers 1 million of the most vulnerable people in our state, if that gets the size of cut that is being proposed right now in Washington, I think that we have to step in to make sure that the most vulnerable people in our state are not harmed. We are in a position to do that, and I think that we should. but we have to be very careful about how we do it.
And I do want to ask quickly a little bit more about that. As you said, so much of this is impacted by what's happening in D.C. Our state budget isn't just made up of state revenue, it's federal funding. And you and I talked before January, before the new Trump administration took office, and there were a lot of concerns about what these cuts could look like. We have seen, kind of sweeping across the board, whether it's education, industry, funding going down significantly, and a lot of back and forth with funding, grants being canceled and then that being overruled and money getting stopped kind of in the middle of the pipeline. So how has your office kind of been handling this? And can you share any insight into what those conversations have looked like with state leadership, as you said, as they consider most likely coming back in September to possibly tweak this state budget?
In the last fiscal year, 2024, we got $14 billion of federal funding. And almost every 2 weeks, I get together with the Secretary of OPM, the Governor's Office, Treasurer Russell. We sit down and we evaluate what's happened. We have a public website that people can go to right now and report if they have lost grants or if they've lost money. And that's important because we need to hear from people. We don't get a memo from the White House every time they cut funds. We just have to find out about it from different nonprofits or school districts and what have you. But look, at the end of the day, I think there's a bit of a misdirection happening, which is the president and Congress, they say they're only trying to get waste, fraud, and abuse. I am all for, as the fiscal watchdog of Connecticut, cracking down on waste, fraud, and abuse, and we do it all the time. We've been doing it in my office since the 1700s. That's not what this is in my mind. I think they are trying to dramatically change what government looks like, and they are trying to pass in this bill a giant tax cut. And to do that, they have to make substantial cuts to things like Medicaid, to things like food assistance to vulnerable people, and cutting government programs that do make a difference in people's lives. We can find waste, fraud, and abuse, and we should. This is not what this is. And I think if this bill goes forward, and if these cuts continue, we are going to be in a position where we're going to have to make some difficult choices. But I hope that the people of Connecticut know that we are aware of this. We do see them, we do hear them, we are understanding of the impact of this. But we have to figure out how to balance the needs of what we are already working on in Connecticut and the needs of what we will have to start working on because of what happens in Washington.
Well, Comptroller, thank you so much. We'll, of course, be watching the federal spending package as it moves through, whether or not it gets passed, and we'll be watching the possibility of a special session here this fall. Thank you so much, as always, for taking a couple minutes to check in with us.
Great to be here.